What I think we're going to do today is just make a big loop that's probably about a mile, a little less than a mile circle, and we'll go in through a couple of fields into Margaret's Rock. We'll stop and talk there for a bit, and then we'll come down. There's one more site that I want to show you on the way out, and we'll come back out through this meadow here and end up back here.
I hope this is a friendly dog.
Just have to walk through with them. Just don't tell anybody you're conducting it to us.
Just pause here quickly. The boundary that I was mentioning between Massachusetts and Rhode Island is pretty much, it runs across the tip of our driveway that we just passed, and then it heads down this direction. And if you walk down this little path, you're all welcome to after we're done. You'll come out to get up on the top here of the little rise and be able to see a granite state boundary marker. And the line, it's hard to see with the sun in our eyes, but this big oak tree that we can see right in the middle behind the telephone poles here,
Yep.
just to the right of it is a really large white pine.
Yep.
And that white pine is the, from where we're standing to that white pine is the Massachusetts Rhode Island boundary line. So when this was all one farm, it was started in 1690 by the Mason family, and it came to them as a spoil of war from the King Philip's War that had happened in 1675-76. And the Mason family was here farming until 1940-ish, and then sold to the Chase family, which still owns the property. So it's kind of a rare property in that it's only had a couple of owners over that whole 400-year history. So it's pretty remarkable.
Keith, is there a conservation easement on this? Or
Yeah, so
there is.
There is, and they were one of the early folks to do it in the 1970s.
So it's a farming easement or something?
Yeah. Well, the basic way that it works is that the state buys out all the development rights,
Right.
and it is expected to stay in farming. But there's some wrinkles in it, and it's a little different for Massachusetts than Rhode Island. And the wrinkle is that if you don't maintain it as a farm and it grows back in, then it becomes forest or woodland, and it falls under the Forestry Services, not agricultural. And you can't clear it without getting special permissions.
It's a current use kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So what's challenging about this as the farmers age out, and I think nationally the small farms, their farmers are an average of about 65 years old. I mean, it's like I'm 63. Like the thought of that's a lot of work, right?
Milking the cows.
So what's happening here, because of some deaths and some transitions that are still in flux, all of this is starting to encroach, and this field that we're going to be going through at this little meadow up here is one of my favorite spots, but I would say its footprint is probably only 2/3 what it was 10 years ago, just because of that sort of slow encroachment. And it's no fault of any one person or one's issue, but what typically happens, what's happening here is that the land is now leased out to tenant farmers, so the hay fields go to one farmer. The Four-Town Farm families use this land and a couple of other fields. And like the Clegg family, the Four-Town Farm folks, they're great farmers. They've been doing it for generations. They're awesome human beings to work with. And they don't own the land, so it's only worth them investing so much in building it up because they have to make a living, and if they put too much into it, they're going to go out of business. So there's some of the younger members of that family have gone off to college to study environmental organic practices, and so they're really sensitive, sustainably oriented farmers, but they can't make a living without using some chemicals to do their farming with. So it's all these kinds of trade-offs, and there's no pure, simple answer to it, but everybody's trying to figure that out. And there's one of the things I'm fascinated by is that there is this sort of nationally this huge generational transition beginning to happen, and this is one place where you can really see it coming. So. Yeah. So let's head out here and take a peek at this field I mentioned, and then we'll be close to Margaret's Rock.
Acres in the virtue
Wow. Great walks.
I wish the session ran.
It's way bigger than I thought it was going to be. I'm incredibly impressed. It's incredible.
Well, and Keith and I go back and forth. He'll talk about Margaret's Rock, but it's often called Margaret's Cave, and that's the cave. And when people think of a cave, they think of
something
like,
that's a little more
more enclosed. But that's not how it works here. So
Yeah, my children were scared. I called it a cave, and they said, "How are you going to get out?" And I was like, "Oh, the cave always has one way. You know, if you get into the cave, you must be able to get out."
yeah, this is not a spelunking trip.
Yeah, so they'll be very relieved. No, I didn't have to go inside.
So this is Margaret's Rock or Margaret's Cave. Chances are pretty good it did. The overhang was a little more pronounced, and pieces of it, you know, it's a metamorphic rock, so it's just a lot of mud and gravel compressed under intense pressure by the glaciers. So it's not as solid as it looks. You can see all the little cracks in it. And in the winters, the water gets in, freezes, just every so often pops off a chunk of it. So, but while we're talking about this ridge, the defining feature of this landscape is stones like this, and this is the southern point of a long ridge like this that runs about almost a half mile north from here, and then it goes back underground half mile and then pops back up. And there's about 6 of these ridges parallel to each other running north and south for about 10 miles. They go down into the northern part of the bay, kind of the whole Kickamuit Reservoir. And the reason there is a Kickamuit watershed is because of these. And what's fascinating to me, kind of watching them, is that they sort of mirror each other. So this one comes up, at the same time the one next to it goes down, and then they kind of go almost like these dragons. Kind of, so you can look at some aerial maps kind of along the Seekonk River, and you can really see how this shapes it. So this is a painting that an artist from the vineyard did, and that Dave was a big part of making happen. And she got very interested in the history of the Wampanoag and contacted folks over here and wanted to do a painting of this place. And the reason for that is that there are 5 tribes that together make up what's now referred to as the Wampanoag, but the tribes don't call themselves that. They call themselves by their tribal identity. And so the group in this area was the Pokanoket Nation, and their story is that they consider themselves, they were the leadership group of this 5 tribe alliance that made up, covered a huge land area, kind of, you know, out into central Massachusetts, out onto Cape and the islands, probably as far south here as Bristol, sort of this big area, but with maybe 40 to 50,000 inhabitants, so pretty small density, light density. And Ruth's painting is showing a bench of land that runs along the east side of this ridge. And I'm happy to go up there with anybody or wait for anybody who wants to go up and take a look. With this bigger group, it might be a little more challenging. But this ridge that we're at, it runs over like north and then goes up, north and then goes up a little bit. So it's got about a 30, 40 foot drop down onto the flat on either side. But on the east side, it comes down about 10 or 12 feet and then flattens out for maybe 50, 60 feet, and then drops off to ground level. And what the best guess is, and what Ruth's painting is of an encampment on that bench of land right there. And it was one of the winter camps for the Pokanoket. It would not have been all of the Pokanoket because they tended to set up camps in 100 to 150 people most of the time. And they wouldn't be here every winter, but they'd be here most winters. And had sort of a semi-permanent setup here. Pretty easy access to water, a lot of game, a lot of harvestable things, some agriculture that they do in dry beans and corn, things like that, some staples. So, fairly robust way to live here. And Margaret was the wife of the Massasoit, which is the Pokanoket word for leader or chief. And the Massasoit's name was Usamaquin, so there's also his Usamaquin conservation area over in Barrington, kind of named after him. And his son, one of his sons, was called King Philip by the British. And the story goes that Roger Williams had met Usamaquin through his travels as part of the Massachusetts, and they told him basically to shut up. He was married pretty well, so he was politically difficult to touch, but they finally told him to shut up or they'd arrest him, and he didn't shut up. And as they were coming to arrest him in the winter of 1636, he made his way, he got out just ahead of the party coming to get him and made his way here. The record suggests that it was a really cold, snowy winter, and he arrived here with pneumonia and had left his family behind. They didn't join him until quite a bit later. And Margaret and Usamaquin and the other people wintering here took him in, nursed him back to health. And I don't know if it's true or not, but the folklore mythology is that this little inlet, this little cave area, would have been where he stayed, probably a lean-to on the outside, a nice little fire going in there, it would heat up pretty well. And I used to wonder if it put a large stress on the resources of this band to be able to share with this stranger who just showed up out of nowhere. And chances are pretty good. Dave and I have also been out here with the tribal historian and some of the current tribal leadership, and their memory of the stories is that this would not have been a real hardship for them, and that in fact they had this prior relationship with Williams that meant that he knew where he was going and expected some hospitality. So part of the politics of all this, because this story almost always centers on Roger Williams and the creation of Providence in Rhode Island, and that's certainly important, but it's some things to think about. Before he showed up here, the Pokanoket had been in this place 8,000 years. Wow. So, they kind of knew the landscape, they had a really good sense of it. But I'll show you in a little bit, when we walk back down around the other way, there's what's reported to be a grave site for the Pokanoket. And in 1619, there was an epidemic that went through this whole region and killed anywhere between 40 and 90% of the Pokanoket, depending whose records you take a look at. And so they're not huge numbers to begin with, but imagine losing even the low end of that. 40% of your extended family is gone quickly. And it's probably a big enough loss that it not only kills individuals and stresses, family units, but it probably really disrupts a lot of traditional cultural practices. Like, how do you bury that many people when there's nobody around who knows how to do that? Chances are pretty good it hit the people who are older, more vulnerable, harder, left behind more kids, and those kids don't have all that local knowledge. So it's a very vulnerable moment. That epidemic does not go as far west as the Narragansett lands. And there's historically, I wouldn't say they're enemies, but they are sometimes, but there's real just tension, political tension between the Narragansett and the Pokanoket. So the Pokanoket find themselves in this very weak and vulnerable position, and they're afraid the Narragansetts are just going to start crowding them out. And they viewed alliances with European colonists like Roger Williams as a way to create protection against other encroachments. And so the way to think about this New England history at that period is that there's this whole complex network of relationships and alliances as people are really trying to look out for their long-term interests. So one artifact that comes out of Roger Williams' relationship with Osamoquin and the Pokanoket is that there's a long period of relative peace. And but by the 1670s, Philip, Osamoquin's son, is starting to really get worried about the encroachments of the Europeans. The first generation of sort of Massachusetts Bay settlers has given way to people who are really coming to get land and grow their businesses or farms or whatever. And they're much more interested in just taking property than they are in kind of negotiating treaties around things. So the pressure is increasing dramatically. The landscape itself is changing. When the first colonists arrived, this is almost all white pine and beech. A little bit of some other stuff, some oak and some hickory and things, but just miles of it up and down the coast from northern Maine all the way down to Connecticut, Long Island area. By 1690, 1700, that's halved. And it's halved by logging, but it's also by the kind of farming practices of the colonists, which use a lot of cows and pigs. And I don't know if you've ever watched pigs go after a landscape, but you don't need a bulldozer because they're just brutal to watch. So a lot of the stone walls even in this area, a lot of them were built by colonists as part of their farming enterprise, but a lot are also built by the indigenous people in the area to keep colonists' animals out of their property. Right. The other thing I find really interesting about this part of the history that I when I retire in a couple of years, I'd really like to spend some time looking at a lot more carefully, is the ways that those treaties are negotiated. And we tend in the culture of the U.S. to think of property as kind of a single entity. Like I'm going to sell you a piece of land and then you own everything about that. And there's some exceptions, but that's kind of the general rule, general practice. Tribes had very different understanding of it and tended to see themselves like the Pokanoket as we are a part of this place. So a lot of tribal names translate into first people. And it's not like I'm having an argument with you that I came before you. It's just that I was the first people here and you were the first people where you're from. And so everybody's tied really into this place and you don't own it. But on the other hand, you are a part of it and you have a lot of right to say what's going to happen to it. So the way that the negotiations would happen is not that I would sell you a piece of property, but I would negotiate that you have the right to come and harvest blueberries, you have the right to come and get deer, you can tap maple trees, there's what are called usufruct rights, the right to use land in a certain way. So almost all the intertribal alliances are built on sharing rights. You have the right to go through this property unmolested, things like that. And what happens with mostly British, but not exclusively British colonists who come, is they take treaties that are written to be around use and transform them pretty quickly into ownership. And so I think a lot of the conflict around King Philip's War comes because of the friction that would understandably come out of that. King Philip's War only lasts about a year and a half. The tribes are pretty well beaten down at the end of it. The Pokanoket survivors, most of them either flee north and join the Passamaquoddy tribe, or they are captured and sold into slavery down in the Caribbean. And race is kind of not a very common idea, actually, the kind of race we think about associated with racism now, but it's starting to emerge, and so they're not sold as slaves in the same sense that an African slave would be, but they're a spoil of war, and it's a way to get them out, from keeping from causing any further trouble. The few Pokanoket that remain in this area are forbidden to practice any of their cultural customs, speak their language, or do anything that would be perceived as a threat to the rest of the European society that was starting to develop here. And it's not until 1940 that those laws are reversed, right? So the reason I mention that, and there's a lot of things we can think about it, but think about what it means to go from, say, 1675, 1690 to 1940 to the present and still be around, like still have a sense of this is who we are. So one of the things that's going on right now is back to how complex the politics of all this are, is there are still 5 bands of the Wampanoag. One of them is the Mashpee down on the Cape, which is where I went to high school and kind of more or less from. This was they were coming into their own when I was in high school and got to watch all of that unfold. But they have federal recognition, they have built a strong community, they have an economy that's a part of their tribe and connects them to the rest of the world down in the Cape. And the Pokanoket don't have federal recognition, and they've been agitating to get it for some time. The Mashpee are resisting that because they don't want the competition around that can go with it. So there's, so it's complicated, right? And Dave's and my understanding is that the Pokanoket's strategy is that to recognize that they probably won't get recognition by pursuing a federal strategy. Their best bet is going to be to work through the United Nations and some of the indigenous heritage institutions that the United Nations is putting into place. So if they can get recognized there, it'll put pressure on the U.S. to recognize them nationally. And so they've got a 100-year strategy. It's kind of what they're working with. So
why would they not get recognition from them?
Well, it gets into all kinds of issues about maybe the crudest and simplest is who is in India, who is a Pokanoket. I think I had a relative 5 generations ago who was some portion. Does that qualify me? And that issue of qualification nationally with any kind of tribal register is brutally.
Yes, I've been living in the Hawaiian Islands for the past 10 years, and there it's like the struggle is real.
Everywhere
for
you
people
go,
to have that ancestral blood connection, it's like who is and who isn't, and they look, everybody,
and then
it's a rainbow of people.
And then the practices were for becoming a part of a tribe way back when were just much more fluid. They didn't have this idea of blood, and that mattered to a degree, but not in the same way that we did. So there's that. There's it allows tribes to begin to put claims on resources, and people will have a range of opinions about the justice or the right outcome of it, but there's a lot of public conversations starting to happen around reparations, and if I am not recognized, then I have no right to make a claim. I just, but if I'm recognized, then, in the Passamaquoddy tribe, I don't know if any of you, we're an old enough looking group, I'm not going to overgeneralize, but remember in the 1970s, to the early 1980s, the Passamaquoddy tribe in Maine hung up real estate transactions for the better part of a decade. Like if you bought and sold undeveloped land in southern Maine in the late 1970s, early 80s, you were taking a guess about how the state was going to recognize your right to own it when that contest, and they've worked it out, and people came out whole. But those kinds of things just get really, really in.
The concept of SOMS came from the history of the land here, and because this was called SOMS, meaning the southern area. If you look at any map, what you see is all these rivulets, the Coal River, the Kikamuit, which created all kinds of coastline, obviously, which is an abundant source of food. So if you're going to settle somewhere in New England, this is the place, okay? Relatively warm, relatively sheltered, and access to water primarily for transportation. We forget that though there were trails and, you know, people would move that way, if you wanted to carry something, you put it in a machine, a boat, and you take it somewhere. And there was a lot of that going on around here. So this was a highly prized area, and therefore was the home of Osamequin, or I call him Osamequin, and probably generations before. We have no written record, so we don't know. There are other Massasoits before Osamequin, and Philip, his second son, is also a Massasoit. We don't call him that, but that was a title that wasn't retired until his death at the end of the King Philip War. But this homeland called Solmes constitutes primarily Bristol, Warren, and Barrington, but can easily be extended up through East Providence, but also Providence. And I've come to learn that Providence wasn't always Narragansett. In fact, they didn't move into the area till sometime after the Great Dying in 1619, because they were ready to move and encroach and come down here. And it wasn't until the treaty with the English that gave the Massasoit Osamequin firepower, okay, which worked. He was captured at one point at the trading post here in what we believe was Warren. Miles Standish came with a few guys with a couple of muskets, and I don't know if they shot at anybody, but as soon as they heard those guns go off, they left, okay? So the strategy worked, okay? And for at least 10 years, it looked like things were going well. And then 1,000 people show up in Mass Bay, and from there on in, it was a steady erosion, as Keith was pointing out. But Solmes has always been the name of the settlement, the primary settlement for the Massasoit. And if you look at the Warren Town Hall, look up above the door, you will see Solmes 1621. Well, that 1621 marks the treaty date, March 22nd, 1621, and the visit on July 3rd, 1621, when Ed Winslow and both of them journeyed down here and met Osamequin in his village, which in the summertime would have been somewhere, if you're from Barrington, it was on Tyler Point. If you're from Warren, it was on the Warren River where downtown is next to them. There are two Massasoit springs, by the way, one in Warren and one in Barrington. So depending on where it doesn't really matter. I mean, they were clearly living here. And so Warren recently adopted the first municipal land acknowledgement, recognizing the Pokanoket people as the original people from this area. So we're very proud of that, and we're working steadily on markers and other kinds of ways of people getting to know the history.
This marker only went up about 7 years ago, maybe, something like that, 6 years ago. And it was erected by the Roger Williams Heirs, Roger Williams Association, and they come out about every other year. And
yeah, I was wondering, like, how long people have been recognizing this place.
Yeah, there are written records from a Warren historian from the 1920s, but as Dave and I have laughed, there's a lot of speculation in what is presented as fact. So you have to read it pretty carefully, but there seems to have been a pretty long tradition of recognizing this as a significant place. There's also on the other side of Route 136 out here another long ledge that was the place where corn was ground, and you can go see that, and people know about that and kind of have known about that for a long time. So this was a pretty significant, just a general area.
Did Devil's Rock, which is fairly close to here, have any significance to the Pokanoket?
Yeah, I've heard different things. There's no nothing I would say really confirms a story, right? But there's another one of these ridges, kind of about, I don't know, what would you say, maybe like a half mile, third of a mile, kind of off to the northeast here. And it's called Devil's Rock because there's a little piece on the top of the ridge where there's a long series of these little holes about this deep and about that big around that look like, the devil's footprints, which is great to scare kids. But,
We talked to Bob Chase before he died. Me and Russ came up. We were here about 11 years ago, and he claims the original Devil's Rock is closer to where he was living. There was a rock face there with the same kind of footprints in.
I would say that, I would trust, he certainly was out here longer than me, But the other story that goes with this particular Devil's Rock that makes a little more sense for why it was kind of a notorious place is that there are stories about some 18th century bandits that were out here, and this was where they would set up camp. And it's again one of these really easily defended places. Nobody can sneak up on you. Fairly easy to get to. The other piece that gets really interesting trying to figure out the history of the landscape out here is that there was also on this property, not too far from where we are, a quarry, a gravel quarry for quite a long time. You can still see some little bits of that. And another one on the other side of the farm. But the Civilian Conservation Corps also came out here in the 1930s and really redirected a lot of the waterways, dammed up a couple things, and really kind of changed the drainage that goes down into the Kickamulet. So it's, it kind of peeling back the layers of it. There used to be a Boy Scout camp out here at one point, from what I've been told. They came out and camped last summer, and I don't think they'll be back. So I don't know why, but yeah. But it's really fascinating history for sure. But other questions about this or anything that other stories to share?
I read an article about the Great Dying in 1619. They were examining the cause, and this guy's article, which if I can find, I'll send it to you.
Yeah,
it was caused by rat urine. It was a bacteria in rat urine that came over on the boats and basically killed people, much like the
It could well be. Yeah, I'd be really curious to see that because there's been a number of arguments put forward, but the current thinking, and maybe this corrects it, is that they really don't know. It wasn't smallpox is about the only thing they can say.
It was a pretty convincing article.
Okay.
Europeans didn't get it because they were already exposed to it.
Yep.
They mentioned it in the Mayflower book. The writer, I forgot his name. Yeah. He talks about what they thought the cause was.
Yeah, the best guess, the one that I think he reports and that sort of people default to is leptospirosis, which is a bacterial infection. It could be this, but there's no physical evidence to back that up. What they're basing it on mostly is stories from people who witnessed it, and then trying to back up from. And to be honest, looking the way that people thought about disease in the 1600s and trying to work from a 1600s description to a 2000s medical taxonomy, a lot of room for. But yeah, it could very well be. That would make a lot of sense.
I can take that article,
Yeah.
It's curious that there wasn't a outbreak prior to that, because there were ships coming along the coast here for 100 years, and then all of a sudden you get a die-off of 90% of the population here. So whether that meant it was a new disease, one theory is that the ships were getting faster coming across, so that finally by 1619 there was a French ship that shipwrecked up in Maine. And one theory is because that coincided with the outbreak that might have been the ship that was carrying it. And the question is,
had a lot of trading relationships.
Oh, absolutely, right. I mean, this is a busy place back and forth, but that they might have carried something that was able to survive. Now no longer a 2-month voyage, but a 1-month voyage. So who knows? It's all speculative.
But sometimes some of the questions I've gotten from folks that visited out here is if it was as intentional as some of the smallpox blankets used out in the West, and there's literally no evidence for that. It was, if it was brought by Europeans, it was really an accident. But it's also really possible, like you say.
Let's hope not.
This has never been excavated?
No, there's been
as an archaeological site?
there's been a couple of archaeologists out here, particularly at the site down here that we'll pause at, but they've never really dug much or been encouraged to dig much. There are a couple of guys who are just like with the metal detectors that are just hobbyists that are out here probably 50 days a year, like different places on the farm. Every time something's plowed, they come out and they've found some colonial artifacts. You know, their best one is they found a silver shoe buckle that's, you know, pretty big. That was like their most exciting thing. But they've been up here and looked, and they've found really no metal artifacts, and the chances are pretty good that any of the other kinds of detritus that would be left behind has probably disappeared. It's just gone back to carbon of some kind. The best guess. The place where the grave site is purported to be, somebody came in and dug a little bit around in there, but there's always this, it didn't find anything, and it's doubtful that there are artifacts that would survive 300 years in kind of a wet, dampish spot. This certainly would not be the only burial site.
Yeah.
You know, it probably was just, I'm guessing, just associated with this encampment.
The rumor was there was 2 or 3 graves high.
Well, you have to really think about the fact that there were literally hundreds of thousands of people living here over time. You know, they weren't embalmed and buried. There were no caskets. You lay them on the side facing the southeast, put objects that were meaningful to them during their lifetime with them, and have a ceremony, and that's how they were buried. You know, most bodies in that situation aren't going to last more than 2 or 3 years before they're just bones, and then the bones will decay if they're not protected. So you really have to think about the fact that everywhere you're going, somebody has lived, and especially if you're near a source of fresh water or salt water.
Yeah, but see actual graves like you're suggesting, those are,
Markers there.
and just a small number of them, you know, I have no idea what it would be, but it gets my curiosity up that that's something else is going on there that's not typical. Interesting to know.
The other settlements in the area include, if you've been down to the Narrows, if you're in Bristol, you know, end of Narrows Road down, and if you're in Tawisset, you look across the Kickamuit River there. That has had a dig in the 90s, I believe, and they did find plenty of evidence that there were people there. That area was probably settled by tens, hundreds of thousands of people over time because of its geographic area and access. You know, you can dig clams, you can fish there, you can hunt there. It's a perfect place to live. And I've even questioned some people who are saying that Philip lived at Mount Hope. Well, Mount Hope is not a great place to live. It's a very steep embankment to get down. There's no easy access to water there. Great for a ceremonial site, but if you want to live somewhere, go a mile north to the Narrows, and my guess is that that's where the settlement was.
The other dig that I'm aware of that found anything is in Barrington, down by Nayet Road, over by the golf course. What's the last north-south road over there? Washington, where Washington intersects with Nayet. Right at that intersection, there was a little building project going on, and they brought in archaeologists to do a dig, and they found quite a number of artifacts.
There's a lot of clay over there, so I wouldn't doubt
probably
if they were using it. But it wasn't speculation that it was a birthing site?
Yeah, there's a place on Echo Lake there. Yeah, and they did do a dig there, and they found a number of hearths there.
Yeah, and there's certain patterns to the storytelling that are like the number of birthplaces that I've heard about is just sort of phenomenal, to the point that it makes you wonder if any of them are have a really particular significance, or if it's just these are places that people habitually used. You know, it's kind of because there's another big erratic rock about as tall as me and much bigger around that just sits in the middle of a field on the other side of the farm, and there's the folklore around that is that it was a birthing place. You know, Another kind of story that's very complicated that goes along with this is that the Mason family that were given the land grant in 1690 after the conclusion of the treaties that ended the war by a king's grant, and then they stayed here. To the stories about the Pokanoket still in the area kind of gathering together, Masons are reported to have had a pretty cordial relationship. You know, they allowed passage through, they allowed people to camp as they were coming through, did not object to some of the ceremonial things that would happen, you know, and just kept the complicating part of that is it's also really hard to imagine what that relationship would be after I just took your house that you lived in for 8,000 years, and, you know, no hard feelings. So it's a little, I don't know, how we want to think about it and how it might have been, we'll probably never know. But,
Yeah, I worked for the Peabody Museum at Harvard when NAGPRA, so National Archaeological and Graves Repatriation Act or something, was put into place, and so they were starting to do the inventories of their collections. But it was there was human remains, sacred items, items of tremendous. There were 5 categories that could be identified, and then the inventory shared with the tribes. Good. But again, it was only the federally recognized tribes who were eligible to participate in this. And then there would be this period of negotiation about what was how it could be transferred back. Yeah.
How about the museum that used to be in the Warren Library?
It's still there.
That's still there?
Yeah, but all the native items that came from grave sites have been removed.
There was a lot there.
Yeah, well,
cars.
my wife was the director at the time, and she and I boxed up a lot of stuff, and then 3 years later the tribe came back and took it all. So
why don't we go ahead and start down just to be sensitive to people's time and certainly continue the conversation. We'll pause just a little bit.
I have to see what's behind it.
The part of the folklore that she relays is that if you went 250 paces to the west of Margaret's Rock, you would come to the burial ground of the tribe that was here. And 250 paces west takes you about 75, 100 feet into this little area, and you can see the land kind of slopes down a bit. And if this is true, that's probably about where it is, but nobody's ever found any official anything to document that, so that's a pretty good guess. This is another farm, just the boundary of the half of Chase Farm that Charlie McCoy now owns is the stone wall that's right there. On the other side of it is a farm that's owned by the D'Alessandro family. And Mr. D'Alessandro is in his 80s, passed away of cancer several years back, and his daughters and son are also kind of in the middle of figuring out what's going to happen next, and are renting the house and leasing out the fields to a couple of different folks for hay and vegetables. So it's another lovely spot. There's about total of probably between these 2 farms, the Swansea watershed, the Warren watershed, the way the roads are, there's probably 1,500 acres, maybe even a little more, of open land in here. And one of the wilder conversations that's starting to happen, very muted, is the possibility of rewilding the whole parcel. Just sort of, and it's not just leaving it alone and seeing what happens, it's kind of managing it back into a really healthy habitat area, rather than trying to maintain it as conventional, traditional farm. So I don't know what I think about that yet. It's being done in some other places around the globe pretty successfully, and this is just big enough to pull that off. So I don't know what you all think, but because it's these little farms are really under an incredible amount of stress, even if they're not being developed. So.
And that was forced.
Yeah. Like we're done pretty much, but any closing comments or questions or?
Thank you.
Great job.
Yeah, this was fun. It was a gorgeous day, and always fun to talk
Great
about.
way to spend a full morning.